Well, hello and welcome again to Classic and Sports Car Centre, to the little lockdown studio on the field, where tonight I'm going to present to you a very rare car. This apparently is the only one of its kind in existence anywhere in the world. Now, the car in question is a 1936 Wolseley, and at first glance I thought, is this a saloon that someone has converted in recent times? Because that's quite a popular thing to do, particularly amongst the wedding car fraternity. But I've done my research, looked into the history quite deeply, and well, there's one or two extraordinary surprises about this very genuine and unique car. Now, the first thing I'm going to do is to just let you have a look at it next to another period car of the era. We have right next to it a 1937 Rover 10. It's actually a 10 with a 12 horsepower engine, but think of it as being quite a smart family car of the 1930s. That particular car dates from 1937. The Wolseley, by contrast, is an enormous car, and it's a car that really at that time would have only been bought by the wealthy and privileged. Now, the history of Morris and their involvement with Wolseley is not really that well known. Wolseley expanded enormously after the First World War. They did very well out of their sales to the War Department, and it was a prolific car manufacturer, but they overextended themselves to the extent that they essentially went bankrupt, and William Morris of Morris Motors fame bought the company personally. So during the late 20s and early 30s, the Wolseley cars were very different to Morris's own cars. There were lots of overhead cam engines. There was some very different engineering. By the late 1930s, there was very much a sort of badge engineering thing beginning to go on, and although Wolseleys were different, for example, they might have different engines, they might have twin carburetors, etc., etc., they were essentially Morris's at their core. And so when this car was built in 1936, someone wanted to take a standard, albeit quite expensive and imposing saloon car, and make it what he wanted it to be. In this case, a Sunshine Saloon, a completely open-top car, which was very much in the style of the coach-built cars of the early 1930s. So it was this little chrome fitting here, and it was this advert that told me actually this was something rather special, because there is no handle in the car. So if the previous owner doesn't have the handle, then we need to make one. Probably we'll use a period wheel brace to create a nice little wind-up handle to raise and lower the roof. What a super mechanism that is. I read online a description from another dealer who sold this car some years ago, who said that there was an invoice in the file for £45,000. Now, I can't see such an invoice in our file, but the evidence that I see on the car is that an absolute fortune's been spent on the comprehensive restoration of this car. The bodywork is really very good indeed, and there's really nothing to spend on panel or paint work. The work's been done and it's really been well executed. So at the end of what has been quite a long day, the bit which I enjoy, which is the test drive, where I snag the car and see what things might be needed to improve it for the next owner. Now, these cars have a crash first and second with synchro mesh on third and fourth, and so essentially first is a crawler gear. So for most driving you can actually use second to set off. Semaphore indicators. Now, the one thing I think this car does need, it doesn't have one, is a temperature gauge, a water temperature gauge. I always think that's a good idea on an old car. You can fit what's called an auxiliary gauge. The oil pressure gauge is showing, well, 100 psi. The engine's not properly warmed up yet, but that's really good. But she pulls well. Speedo showing 45 miles an hour. I actually think 45 to 50 is enough with an old car like of this age until you get really used to it. Apparently they would originally go 65 to 70, but I wouldn't want to try it. So let's see how she brakes. Yeah, brakes in a straight line. So let's try her up to 45 to 50. Yeah, that feels just nice. 45 miles an hour, 47 miles an hour. Now the one thing that cross-ply tyres do is they follow the line features in the road. So I'd be inclined to fit, even though they weren't designed for this car, you get a much smoother ride and much more precise steering if you go for a fairly hard sidewall radial, which is a bit like a modern small commercial vehicle tyre, but actually they're ideal for this sort of car. Now she's quite warm now, we're at operating temperature, and at idle we have 50 psi, which is absolutely fantastic, actually almost 60. The red light comes on the dash because obviously at idle the dynamo's not charging. The minute you've got any RPM, she's showing a positive charge. Now we do a lot of distance selling, and it's really very important that we go beyond the sort of flowery description of how wonderful the car is and tell you all the things that are wrong with it that we would find with what you might call an expert eye, and what we're going to do about it. So I think the best thing about this car, apart from its uniqueness and its and that beautiful sunshine roof, is the fact that the body and trim and the whole sort of structural restoration has been done so very well. The things that are wrong with it are all the detail things. We often say the 10% of the restoration that's hardest to do. So there's a list of things that I would do, beginning with changing all the tyres because they're ancient, and I'm sure because they had plenty of tread on them, the restorer thought, well, that'll be great, but they may be as much as 40 years old. They're auto-away tyres at the back, and India tyres which are ancient, and they're no longer round. You get lots of flats on cross-ply tyres. They need changing for sure, and they will transform the smoothness of the ride. That's the first thing I would do. The second thing I would do is actually on the door check straps. They have these rather intricate check straps, which you can probably see there, and what happens is when you fold them in, look, they have a tendency to fold to the right, and what they then do is jam. What they should actually be doing is going in like that. Now that will be quite a nasty, fiddly job to do, but it's absolutely essential, and that will make the doors close much more easily, because occasionally, as you just saw there, they catch on the edges and they start to jam. That's very important, and that needs to be done. The third thing that needs doing, in my view, is a brake overhaul. When I see when a car comes to us and it's got tyre pressures consistently down to under 20, that tells me that it's been standing for a long time with very little use. And so, I mean, that obviously contributes to flats on tyres, but one of the other things it does is it means that the brakes haven't been used, and therefore they get sticky. And I can feel the brakes, they work well enough, they work in a straight line, but it needs a proper brake overhaul. So I'd do that. I think there's also been some fuel dilution of the oil through starting and not having proper decent runs. So I'd be changing the engine oil for a good quality oil. And then the rest of it is detail, I think, and cosmetic things, like making a nice new fabric cover for the hood, having a handle made that fits that cranking mechanism, because it is quite easy to lower it to people by hand, but how much easier just to do it in the way that it was originally designed by turning that handle there. And there was one noise on test drive which I didn't like the sound of, a little bit of whether it was clutch release bearing sound or a bearing somewhere there in the transmission that just seemed a little bit whiny. I'd want to investigate that and deal with that. And then for sure, the person who gets this car after us will have the benefit of a car that's actually nicer than any of the previous owners have experienced since it was restored. So as you see, the upholstery, trim, bodywork, woodwork, it's all been so really very well done. It deserves that bit of extra effort now just to, if you like, to finish it off. There's one other thing I wanted to say, and that is that it does have a battery isolator switch. You can just see in the glove box there's a sort of red cover for it, but it has one of those key operated battery isolator switches, so that when you leave the vehicle you can turn the power off completely. So now into the setting sun, one final shot of an absolutely stunning pre-war Wolseley